Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's subject is the 2012 film Prometheus, the official return of Ridley Scott to the Aliens franchise. The request has come from patron Voltic Surge. The story about the story. After the film Alien made boatloads of cash despite the critical response, Brandywine and 20th Century Fox knew they would make a sequel, but thanks to the arguments about accounting and payments, they didn't start work on it until 4 years later. At that point, Ridley Scott was busy with Blade Runner, and so they got James Cameron to direct the sequel, fresh from his success with the original Terminator. Aliens was released in 1986, and it became an even bigger hit than Alien. However, Alien 3 and Alien Resurrections suffered from constant studio interference and production issues, and they almost killed the franchise entirely. Still, by the early 2000s, Fox was interested in creating a new Alien movie, and they approached Ridley Scott to direct it, but then it turned into Alien vs. Predator and Aliens vs. Predator Requiem, which were a couple of films that basically went full B-movie, and really only saw success because of brand recognition. Despite the snub, Ridley Scott was still interested in directing a prequel to Alien, and so in 2009, Fox began production for the film that would eventually be called Prometheus. In the meantime, Ridley Scott had had a very interesting career as a director. Blade Runner was his next project, and while the film tanked at the box office, it was later redeemed by a director's cut version that went on to create a whole fad of director's cut and extended cut editions. Legend is a crazy fantasy film, Thelma and Louise is a classic road trip drama, and Gladiator is a historical drama that won an Oscar for Best Picture. Scott also directed a personal favorite of mine called Kingdom of Heaven, which was another film redeemed by a director's cut edition. Just about the only kind of film Ridley Scott hadn't done by that point was a return to an old franchise. Much like the other sequels, Fox began meddling with Prometheus pretty much right away. First, they demanded that Ridley Scott direct the project himself instead of producing, and then they demanded that they aim for a PG-13 rating instead of the hard R that Scott wanted. He eventually got that R, but it was still so up in the air during production that all of the R-rated scenes had to be isolated and filmed separately in case the studio wanted a PG-13 cut. On the other hand, Scott was able to get the screenwriter he wanted, a man named Joe Spates, and the goal of the script was to explain the mysteries of the alien planet encountered in the first movie. Scott then sent it to a second scriptwriter, Damon Lindelof, who did his best to make the film distinct from Alien. That's also why the film is called Prometheus instead of Alien Prometheus. Ridley Scott has always been more of a set director than an acting director, and so most of the production money for Prometheus went into developing detailed and intricate sets, and filming on location in Iceland and the Scottish mountains. He also minimized the use of CGI, and apparently he only filmed in front of a green screen 6 times during production. The protagonist of the film, Elizabeth Shaw, is played by Noomi Rapace. Rapace's first big movie was the original Swedish version of the film The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and that was how Ridley Scott found out about her. The rest of the main cast includes a lot of famous Hollywood names, including Michael Fassbender as David the Android, Charlize Theron as Meredith Vickers, the corporate agent, and Idris Elba as Janek, the captain. Prometheus brought in a worldwide box office of $403.4 million against a $125 million budget, making it a financial success, but less than what Fox was hoping for. It also got a somewhat mixed reception from critics. By 2012, critics were used to seeing intelligent science fiction movies, and they loved the visuals and the performances by the actors, but the plot itself they considered predictable and often pretentious. Will I have the same opinion? Let's find out. The review. Thousands, or possibly millions of years ago, a humanoid alien, who is later referred to as an engineer, drinks some black goo that kills him and releases his DNA into Earth's biosphere. In 2089, Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway discover a set of star coordinates in Scotland that matches up with similar coordinates found in other ancient civilizations, and to them at least, it proves that alien life forms have been communicating with ancient humans. They want to know who these aliens were and why they created and then abandoned us, and so they convince Peter Weyland of the Weyland Corporation to fund an expedition ship named the Prometheus and take it to those coordinates. When the ship arrives at its destination, a relatively habitable moon orbiting a gas giant, they discover engineer ruins around 2,000 years old, along with several dead engineers. After several very foolish experiments with the contents of the ruins, the crew realizes the ruins are a staging area, and the engineers were bringing organic weapons of mass destruction to Earth. However, it's not clear why they were doing this, and when the crew releases the one surviving engineer from cryostorage, he attacks the humans and immediately starts his ship up to fly to Earth. The captain of the Prometheus rams the ship to keep it from leaving, and after that, the lone survivors, Elizabeth Shaw and the torn-up android David, decide to take one of the other alien ships back to where they came from so that they can get some answers. I enjoy a lot of Ridley Scott's productions, but in this case, I was not particularly impressed. Prometheus doesn't feel like one coherent film. It feels like two very different films that were awkwardly stapled together. One of them is a horror film featuring monsters, space truckers and space scientist truckers making stupid decisions, and gory special effects. The other film is a wondrous exploration of outer space, self-discovery, and the meaning of faith in the face of an uncaring creator. I'm sure I would have enjoyed either of these films on their own, but as it is, I can only really focus on the giant staples that are trying to hold them both together. The first part of the film features a lot of awkward setups for the plot devices and symbolism that will show up in the later acts. In the most blatant ways possible, we learn things like there's a fully independent lifeboat on the Prometheus. That lifeboat has an automated surgical bed. Elizabeth Shaw is a Christian who wears a cross around her neck. Peter Weyland is worried about his death and has terrible old man prosthetics. And David the android resents his father figure, even though he supposedly shouldn't have those kinds of emotions. I'll admit that establishing these things is better than throwing them at you without warning later on, but when it's done so blatantly, it makes it painfully obvious where the movie is going to go next. Another issue is with the decisions made by a lot of the characters. David infects Charlie with a bioweapon without doing any sort of testing on it beforehand. Then, when Charlie feels sick and sees a worm pop out of his eyeball, he goes on another expedition instead of going to sickbay. Fifield the geologist tries to leave the search team early, but he gets left behind because he gets lost in the installation tunnels, despite being the guy who brought the mapping orbs and who was established to be in contact with the orbs thanks to his arm controls and a head-up display. If anyone else had gotten lost, it would have made more sense. Then at the end there's the bit where Elizabeth and Meredith are running directly away from a crashing ship, even though it's clear they could have reached safety if they had run at even a slight angle instead. In Alien, you can understand the bad decisions since the crew is a bunch of space truckers who are completely unequipped for what they're up against. The Prometheus is a $1 trillion expedition with a ship equipped for anything and a hand-picked crew that should have been trained to expect just about anything since this was potentially a first contact mission. What was excusable in the first movie's crew is not excusable here. Prometheus is too pretentious to be a brains-off horror flick and too silly to be a proper science fiction drama. In its favor, I will say that the actors do well with the roles they were given, and Ridley Scott always knows how to put on a show, but whether you're a fan of Alien in particular or Ridley Scott productions in general, you can safely skip this film. The analysis. Since this movie is really a pair of movies stapled together, that means it has two sets of themes. Let me start with the horror movie theme, since that's the most direct follow-up to Alien, and it uses the recurring theme I've discussed before. In this case, the variation runs thus. Beware the unknown, for it may provide answers that you don't want to hear. The goal of the Prometheus mission is to answer some of the most existential questions that humanity has ever asked. Why are we here? Who created us? And what is our purpose? The ship entered the unknown to find the answers to these questions, but as it turns out, what they find is a lot less vindicating and noble than what they were hoping for. Instead of a thriving homeworld, the crew finds an abandoned staging area full of biological weapons, And while the engineers clearly interacted with humans several thousand years ago, at some point they decided that their experiment had failed, and they decided to destroy some or all of Earth's population. For that matter, it could be that weapons testing was the engineers' end goal from the beginning. It seems like that would be a tremendous resource investment just to build a biological weapons testing range, but we don't know enough about the engineers to rule that out. So that's what makes it the cautionary theme of this cosmic horror story. Exploring the unknown allows us to find new answers for important questions, but those answers aren't always good news. But then that's just one of the themes. Here's the other one. Parents must make way for their children. Meeting the makers of humanity might be some big era-defining moment, but individually, humans meet their makers all the time. It's as simple as going to visit your parents for dinner. And while the reasons and circumstances between parents and children can be different in each specific case, the one thing that children in general do for their parents is take over. Even if we don't inherit our family's business, each generation does inherit the world. This theme of inheritance appears in nearly every aspect of the movie, including some of the otherwise mindless horror aspects. Elizabeth Shaw loves her father and loves the Christian God, but both of them died prematurely. Her father from an Ebola infection and Jesus through crucifixion. However, Elizabeth herself cannot become a mother, or at least she couldn't until she gets infected by a biological weapon and has a cesarean operation to remove the thing that grows in her womb. Peter Weyland is another example of the parent-child conflict. Weyland would rather cling to power for as long as possible than retire and let his daughter take control. And the reason he funds the Prometheus expedition is in the hopes that the engineers have the secret to eternal life and are willing to share. Instead, what he finds is essentially himself. The engineers are trying to kill humanity, their children, so that they won't rise up and challenge their mastery of the stars. That's why the living engineer gets violent without trying to communicate with the humans, and he starts the ship up without checking its payload or the rest of the crew, because he realizes from the humans' presence that he may be already too late to stop us. David's character is another aspect of the theme. David is an android, a sapient being created by humans, and then constantly degraded and underestimated by his living crewmates, and in particular by his father figure, Peter Weyland. Even the well-meaning members of the crew assume that David doesn't have negative emotions or ambitions, and yet while he is stiff and hard to read, he can definitely feel things like anger and resentment. Towards the end of the movie, he tells Elizabeth, "Doesn't everyone want their parents dead?" Elizabeth didn't, but then her parents never stood between her and her ambitions. David and Meredith, on the other hand, both being children of Weyland by one means or another, have a lot in common. A stiff demeanor, blonde hair, and a sense of both resentment and obedience towards their father. In the end, the demonic parent, the engineer, is killed by the demonic baby that it was ultimately responsible for creating. By that point, the last survivors of the expedition are Elizabeth and David, who make an interesting pair. Elizabeth believes in a compassionate creator god, and David is a robot who, according to her compassionate religion, has no soul. Elizabeth loves her father, David resents his. Both of them are children of someone, but they can have no children of their own. And in the end, both of them decide to search for more answers, despite knowing that they might not like them. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.